A History of Ancient Israel, Lecture 4, King David in History and Tradition.
In this lecture, we will take a look at King David, one of the most beloved figures in the Hebrew Bible. He's also one of the most enigmatic. Much has been published about him in the past decade or two alone, and so we will have our hands full with all kinds of information. In particular, I would point you back to 1993 and 1994, when 3 fragments of an inscription in Old Aramaic were discovered at the site of Tel Dan in the north of Israel. If the restoration and translation of this inscription are correct, it is the first mention of David, or rather the house of David, that's been found outside the Bible. It goes as follows: "And Hadad went in front of me, and I departed from the 7 something of my kingdom, and I slew mighty kings who harnessed thousands of chariots and thousands of chariot horses. I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziahu, son of Joram, king of the house of David. And I set their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation." This is the first mention of the house of David, Beit David, that's ever been found outside of the Bible. We will come back to this inscription in a little bit. Now, David founded a dynasty that was destined to rule from Jerusalem for the next 400 years. Even after Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BCE, ending the long line of Davidic kings, many of the people of Jerusalem and Judah continued to hope for a restoration of the days of old when the house of David was secure on the throne. So it's not at all surprising that David received so much attention in the biblical materials, or that there was such an obvious effort on the part of the ancient Judean compilers of these materials to present him in a favorable light. The Hebrew Bible devotes 42 chapters to David and portrays him as God's chosen, the true and righteous king. And then we have a second extended biblical account in Chronicles, which begins its history of Judah with David and devotes 20 chapters to his reign. And David is presented as the ideal hero, God's man who can do no wrong. And then finally, David is associated by tradition with the book of Psalms, where 13 of the individual psalms are connected with particular moments in his career. Now, still, there are a number of basic questions that face anybody trying to study David's reign and the period of the United Monarchy. Can archaeology or other sources throw light on the transition that is taking place in Israelite society, that is from tribal life back in the period of the Judges to the time of a centralized monarchy? Does archaeology actually indicate that a mighty kingdom existed, such as was described in the biblical sources? And to what extent are all the elaborate commercial and political relations that are described in the Bible actually reflected in the archaeology remains? Unfortunately, the extra-biblical evidence, the evidence outside the Bible for the period of the United Monarchy, is sparse, is often controversial, and does not provide unequivocal answers to these questions. So once again, although we can try to trace the history of this period, there are many debates that are ongoing and many questions that are still left unresolved, which, at least in my mind, makes this period even more interesting and still relevant to today than ever before. Now, let me begin by saying there have been no fewer than 4 or 5 books published on David in the last decade alone, even in the last couple of years, and that one of the conclusions that these authors came to is that David was not someone whom it would be wise to invite home to dinner. So he is not the absolutely wonderful person that one might expect. And indeed, another author has described the story of David as reading more like a modern soap opera. Plenty of sex, plenty of violence, and lots of struggles for power. So again, something that would appeal to the modern-day reader. David is described as a charismatic leader who, and I'm quoting here, played exquisitely, fought heroically, and loved titanically, end quote. Well, it's become customary in scholarship about the Bible to divide the stories of David into two sections, each of which has its own themes. One section would be the history of the rise of David. That would be the stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel about how David came to power and came to be the king. And the other would be the so-called succession narrative, which is mostly in 2nd Samuel and the book of 1st Kings, in which it talks about life once David was king. Now, it's debated as to when each of these books was written and actually consolidated, but overall we get a picture of what life was like for David. We also seem to have two separate themes in here, one strand of which is written from a northern perspective, that is, the land of Israel in the north, and the other of which is written from a southern perspective, that is, the land of Judah in the south. Of course, these divisions, North Israel and South Judah, are not going to take place until after the reigns of David and Solomon, when the united monarchy split into the divided kingdoms. But it will come into play because it is during the reign of the divided monarchy that these accounts are most likely consolidated and written down. So as might not be unexpected, we have stories of David written by several, or at least two, different perspectives. The stories about David's rise to power may be familiar to most of you, but again, let me run through them briefly to bring everybody up to speed. David is going to be anointed as king by Samuel. He fights with Goliath. The famous fight between David and Goliath is well known. But let's begin at the beginning. We're told that Samuel meets with Jesse, David's father, who brings all of his sons to see him. But Samuel puts out the proverbial question, are all your sons actually here? One is in fact missing, the youngest, namely David, who has to be called in from tending the flock. We are told of David's rise to power, where he starts out being a minstrel for Saul during his melancholy period, but rapidly is promoted from being Saul's minstrel to being his armor bearer. He then has his first successes as a young warrior and a commander, so that the women sing that Saul has slain thousands, but David has slain 10,000s. And then there is the famous friendship between Saul's son Jonathan and David, which eventually serves to increase the mistrust of Saul as he becomes increasingly unstable. There is a fight, a quarrel. Saul tries to kill David, and David then runs away and returns back to Judah, his homeland, where he becomes a mercenary, maintaining and leading his own personal troops. We're told of at least 600 such men that are mentioned, and David leads a life as a warrior. He is said at this point in his career to have been a kind of a bandit, an outlaw, who was tolerated rather than admired. In fact, though, he will have served a good purpose in Judah at that time, which was independent. And we are told that David operated in large part with Saul pursuing him. And so it might not be surprising that we see that David enters into the service of the Philistines, of all people, albeit temporarily. Now, when Saul is killed, there's a new situation that comes into play. Once David becomes king, his kingdom assumes a very different character from that of Saul's. Saul had been coming from a tradition of charismatic leaders. He was a military king, king of a nation, but he didn't have a permanent foundation among the tribes. Saul had no real residence. He had no effective administration. David, on the other hand, gets himself a residence, gets himself a very effective administration. But he wasn't necessarily a charismatic leader, that is, in terms of what it meant back previously, that is, ruling from God, by God, and of God. He's a warrior. He's supported by his troops, their successes. He is independent of the tribes, and he becomes king over the territory by being a proven man. He rules over a nation which is limited and yet is going to expand quite fast. Now, we are told quite a number of stories, which we don't need to go into detail about them here, but they involve Saul's daughter, Michal. In particular, we are interested, though, in the story of how David takes possession of Jerusalem. David had first ruled from Hebron for about 7 years. He had expanded his territory to the north, and in expanding territory to the north, he decided that the city of Hebron was not suitable to being his capital anymore. He wanted a city that was politically neutral, geographically neutral, and one which was relatively isolated. Now, Jerusalem itself is in a rather interesting position. It's high up on the hills of the hill country which we mentioned earlier, but it is not at the crossroads of any great trade routes. It is geographically separated from most of David's territory. It's politically neutral, if you want to put it that way. And from this, his new capital, David could rule both north and south without any baggage brought to it. And so the formulation of his kingdom is what seems to be David's foremost achievement. It was a personal achievement that he made, but in the long run, it's his capture of Jerusalem that may have been the most important. I would consider David's capture of Jerusalem from the Jebusites somewhere around the year 1000 BCE to be among the 10 most important conflicts for Jerusalem fought in its history. And I should mention that there have been more than 100 battles fought for control of Jerusalem over the past 4,000 or 5,000 years. But David's capture of Jerusalem is what brought Judaism to the city and began a long tradition and association of the city with three of the great religions of the world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So our time is about 1000 BCE. The Jebusites are controlling the city, and David is going to capture it. There is only one really good way to capture the city of Jerusalem, and that's from the north. The city is protected on three sides by deep wadis or ravines. It's only on the north that one can really capture the city, and time again, this is how the city is in fact captured. Unfortunately, we're not exactly sure how David captured Jerusalem. The text of 2 Samuel presents a number of difficulties in translation, especially with the Hebrew word sinor. In the King James Version, this is translated as gutter, but in the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, it's assumed that sinor means a water shaft, and the implication is that David's soldiers, in particular Joab, his right-hand man, climbed up some sort of water shaft from near the Gihon spring and entered the city that way. However, the New English Bible translates sinor as a grappling iron, and others translate sinor meaning ladder or anything else. So, in other words, we're not exactly sure how David captured the city. For the very long time, people were pointed to something called Warren's Shaft, and it was discussed that this was how Joab climbed up the city. But it can now be shown that Warren's Shaft was not in use until about the year 800 BCE, a good 200 years after the time that David captured the city. Instead, within the last couple of years, rescue operations, archaeology conducted in the vicinity of the Gihon Spring on the eastern side of Jerusalem, have now shown that the Canaanites built fortifications, towers, and walls designed to protect the Gihon Spring, the only water source for Jerusalem, as early as the 18th century BCE, that is, about the time of Abraham. These constructions would have been already 800 years old by the time David came along, and they are perhaps the tzinor that allowed Joab to climb up through the water system and enter into the middle of Jerusalem sometime around midnight. He and his men would have killed the guards at the gate, opened up the gates to Jerusalem, and in marched David and his men. And thus Jebusite Jerusalem became Israelite Jerusalem. Now at this time, Jerusalem is on the eastern spur. There are two spurs of land running side by side, and David is capturing the easternmost of these, in fact the southeastern. Over time, Solomon would expand up to the north on that ridge, and then over the centuries the city would expand to the west, gradually filling in the ravine in the middle and taking over then the western ridge as well until it looks as it does today. Once he captured the city, David promptly brought the Ark of the Covenant there. We are told that he put it in a tabernacle and danced around it, got in trouble for doing that, and that he put the Ark of the Covenant right on top of the rock on which Abraham supposedly was going to sacrifice Isaac. This is the rock that today is inside the Dome of the Rock, and it is the rock that lay inside Solomon's temple. Indeed, Solomon built the temples, among other reasons, specifically to house the Ark of the Covenant, but that is something that we will leave for the next lecture. Suffice it to say that with the bringing of the Ark to Jerusalem, David made the city not only his political capital, but also his religious capital. One of the problems that we've got, though, is the fact that archaeology has been unable to pinpoint any or many of the structures that belong to David's Jerusalem. There is not much that we can definitively say dates to the 10th century in Jerusalem, and this has been an ongoing problem ever since. Kathleen Kenyon excavated in Jerusalem, Yigal Shiloh excavated in Jerusalem, as have other people, and there have been a number of instances in which people have said, aha, this dates to David's reign, only to have other archaeologists disagree with them. The most recent that I would point to are the excavations of Eilat Mazar, where she has identified a large building recently uncovered as possibly a palace or the palace of David, but this remains to be proven. We need more excavation. The other aspect that David's capture of Jerusalem has given rise to is the political ramifications, and indeed that original battle fought between David and the Jebusites 3,000 years ago for control of Jerusalem is still being fought today, mostly because the modern Israelis claim to be descendants from the Israelites, and the modern Palestinians claim to be descendants of the Canaanites and the Philistines. In particular, Yasser Arafat used to say things like, and I quote here directly, "Our forefathers, the Canaanites and Jebusites, built the cities and planted the land. They built the monumental city of Beer-Salim," that is Jerusalem, end quote. So we have today, in the modern political and physical battles between Israelis and Palestinians, still the original battle between David and the Jebusites, the Israelites and the Jebusites, being fought still some 3,000 years later in the modern politics today. As Ephraim Karsh, a professor in London, has said, it's not that the Middle East leaders are suddenly big believers in the Bible or avid readers of history books. The obsession with the past is geared toward reinforcing the modern foundations of power, end quote. And I would agree with Professor Karsh that here those who control the past are able to control the present, and so Jerusalem and David's battle for it still figure prominently in the discussions today. Well, back to ancient history, once David has captured the city, we find him in collusion, shall we say, with the famous Bathsheba, with whom he falls in love after seeing her bathing. And it is after the union of David and Bathsheba that we get the birth of Solomon, who will continue his father's process of expansion of the kingdom or empire and ruling over what we now refer to as the United Monarchy. Let us now return back to those three fragments of the Aramaic inscription that were found at Tel Dan in 1993 and 1994. These fragments mention the house of David, as well as the kings of both Israel and Judah. When they were first found, they were dated to the 9th century BCE. It's now clear that the inscription does come from that period, but should be specifically dated to about the year 842 or 841 BCE. Now this is important because it's the first time that the name David has been found in any ancient inscription outside the Bible, and it would therefore be the oldest extra-biblical reference to Israel apart from the Merneptah stele, which we talked about, which is a couple of hundred years older. Now, this inscription has been fleshed out a little bit further. It's currently translated as follows. Let me read it again. And Hadad went in front of me, and I departed from the 7 somethings of my kingdom, and I slew mighty kings, who harnessed thousands of chariots and thousands of chariot horses. I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Joram, a different Joram, king of the house of David. And I set their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation. This inscription has been now attributed to King Hazael of Aram, Aram being modern-day Damascus. He usurped the throne of ancient Damascus sometime between 845 and 842 BCE, and was the very same king against whom the Bible says that the 2 kings named in the inscription were fighting. The biblical story in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles says that Joram led the army of Israel against King Hazael of Aram during the summer of 841 at the Battle of Ramoth Gilead, which is across the Jordan River from the Jezreel Valley. In that battle, Joram is wounded and was wounded apparently severely enough. He's taken from the battlefield and brought over to the city of Jezreel to recover in relative peace. And at that time then, Jehu, a commander in his army, takes advantage of the king's absence to stage a coup and has himself declared king. And we meet Hazael of Aram in this story. And in the course of the story, with Jehu's coup and the murder of the 2 kings, one of Israel and one of Judah, we then meet Jezebel, widow of Ahab, mother of Joram, daughter of the Phoenician king of Sidon, and queen mother in Israel. Jezebel is going to get herself thrown out of the window for her troubles. So we've got a biblical account of Hazael and Jehu and Joram and Ahaziah and everybody else mentioned, at least to some degree, in this inscription. So we're fairly confident in dating it to about 842 and 841. Unfortunately, we've got some problems attested right here, namely because in the inscription, Hazael claims credit for killing Joram and Ahaziah, the king of Israel and Judah, and yet in the biblical account, Jehu is to be blamed for these murders. Now, we're not going to resolve this today. In fact, I will leave that for our upcoming lecture. But let me simply say that all of this proves that this inscription is valid and that we can use it to work with the existence of David and the house of David. Or can we? There's a little bit of a problem here because the critical letters in the inscription are usually the ones that are translated as House of David, that is Beit David or Beit David. But others have said that this is not meaning the house of David, that maybe it means the house of the uncle or the house of the beloved or even the house of the kettle, which doesn't make much sense to me, but scholars do say that one could translate these words differently. And so there are a number of ongoing discussions about this inscription. While we're on the topic, there have been other inscriptions now identified that may mention David as well. There's the so-called Mesha stele, Mesha meaning being a king of Moab over on the other side of the Jordan River. And in here, in this inscription, we may have a mention of the king of Israel and a mention of the house of David. But this inscription is very much broken and is quite debated. There may be another mention down in Egypt in a list left by King Shishak of Egypt, whom we will meet in a future lecture. And here we've got perhaps a mention of David as well. Now, all of these inscriptions have come to light or been reinterpreted just in the last couple of years, and so now we might have more mentions of David than we ever thought before. On the other hand, we have a little bit more of a problem because we've got a group of scholars referred to by others as biblical minimalists. Some call them the Copenhagen School, which isn't exactly appropriate because some of them are at the University of Sheffield in England, while others are at the University of Copenhagen. And these biblical minimalists tend to argue that all of this is made up. And by all of this, I mean the history of Israel, the history of Judah, David, Solomon. They're arguing that none of these actually existed. Now, this is one of the most fiercely debated issues in biblical archaeology today, namely the historicity of the Bible and of biblical chronology. These biblical minimalists take the view that the Bible is a narrative of mythology. It's mythology interwoven with some historical elements. But history, they say, is an essentially modern term, and that trying to read the Bible as a historical text, in the modern sense of the term, is doomed from the start. And they say this because the Bible is written in a tradition of storytelling and religious worship, not with the intention of relating facts in a history. And we've already seen that this is in fact the case. But they go further and say that the united monarchy and that the figures of David and Solomon are legendary and not historical at all. In short, biblical minimalists say that the Bible is in fact very nearly irrelevant for reconstructing the history of ancient Palestine, as they tend to call it, and especially of the people that we know of as the ancient Israelites. So what they're doing, this is a method of scholarship within biblical studies. It became very popular, especially during the 90s, but it has its origins all the way back in about 1968, when a couple of essays were written by professors in Copenhagen that advocated a complete rethinking of the way that we approach the Bible and the way that we attempt to draw historical conclusions from it. Minimalism and minimalists are seen by some people as derogatory terms, but it's become the way used to describe this school of thought. The other term that we can use is the Copenhagen School because that's where the movement began and where it has its main advocates. But again, as I say, others are at Sheffield and indeed elsewhere. Essentially, biblical minimalism arose out of the need to account for some of the major discrepancies between the Bible and what archaeologists have dug up in Israel and Palestine, or rather what archaeologists have failed to dig up in Israel and Palestine. So what we've got is the question, again, of just how much we can use the Bible and how much we are dependent upon archaeology to prove, disprove, or corroborate the biblical account. In this case, the arguments about the legitimacy of David and whether he existed or not can be put into a larger context in which these minimalists are questioning pretty much anything that happens in the Bible. And I would include in here the whole Abraham and the patriarchs discussion and whether the Exodus took place or not, and exactly what is happening during the whole period of Judges and the united monarchy of David and Solomon. Whether this is to be seen as a related series of accounts that are written down in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE by people trying to create an earlier history, or whether all of these things actually happened. And so we have, for example, one of the newest books that's been published by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silverman, entitled The Bible Unearthed, reconsiders the whole historical period that produced the Hebrew Bible, and indeed takes a look at the existence of Abraham and the existence of Moses and the Exodus, and then goes through and discusses David and Solomon as well. And one of the things that these authors point out, they claim fairly convincingly that the kingdoms of Israel and Judah became very different regions even before the time of King David, and that we have no archaeological evidence that Jerusalem was anything more than a modest highland village in the time of David and Solomon. Now, it is true that we don't have much evidence for what Jerusalem looked like in the 10th century BCE, but many other people see the downgrading of David and Solomon as being rather ominous. We've got people accusing Finkelstein and some of the other people of having a political agenda, which they deny. And others have said that what these people are doing are giving ammunition to people who might be anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. Nonsense, these people reply. Research is research, and people can do what they want with it. What we've got here, however, is a classic dilemma. We have the biblical stories on the one hand, which paint a picture of David in intense detail with very small strokes. On the other hand, we've got absolutely no archaeological evidence to prove any of this, and we had, until the finding of the Tel Dan stele, no extra biblical evidence mentioning David whatsoever. Now we do have the house of David mentioned, most of us think, in the Tel Dan stele. We may have it appearing in the Mesha stele and in Shishak's inscription as well. So there is now good evidence that someone named David actually did exist, but whether it is the biblical David or some other David is still being argued today, and this is a topic that continues to generate controversy and more books. We have not seen the last of them, that's for sure. Basically, we have a pitched battle being fought between those who consider the Old Testament to be reliable and those who, on the other side, say that it contains pure mythology. And our King David is caught right smack in the middle of this. Solomon is also caught here as well, and it is in the next lecture that we will take a look at Solomon and his reign, both from the point of view of the biblical account and the point of view from the archaeology and any extra biblical text that we may have. So David and Solomon and their united monarchy, on the one hand, continue to fascinate, and on the other hand, continue to resonate today in all of the scholarship and arguments ongoing.
After listening to Lecture 4, a student posed this question to Professor Klein. How can we resolve whether or not David existed? Let's listen to the professor's response.
The way to resolve all of these issues on this question is, as we say in archaeology all the time, we need to do more digging. We need more excavations. It's only through more inscriptions, which undoubtedly are out there. If David did exist, there are other inscriptions that mention him or mention the house of David, and if they exist, they will eventually be found. If David did capture Jerusalem and did build up Jerusalem, as the Bible says, then there will be buildings, there will be artifacts there, and these simply remain to be found. Of course, the problem is that Jerusalem is completely inhabited as a modern city today, so it's very hard to find anything. But if Eilat Mazar is finding anything today in terms of her recent excavations, if her Palace of David does indeed turn out to be both a palace and belonging to David, then we may well be on our way to being able to resolve the issues that at the moment are being fiercely debated.
This ends Lecture 4. Remember to visit this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures you just heard. A History of Ancient Israel, Lecture 5, King Solomon in History and Tradition.
In this lecture, we'll take a look at King Solomon. That is King Solomon in History and Tradition. Solomon is renowned for his wisdom, his wealth, and his wives, and he's credited in the Hebrew Bible with ruling over an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates. However, like David, Solomon and his accomplishments have become the subject of recent controversies and debates, including his building activities at the sites of Jerusalem and Megiddo, among others. Solomon's reign was considered to be the golden age of Israelite and Judean history, or at least that's what one would conclude from a casual reading of the biblical account. His reign lasted 40 years, approximately 970 to 930 BCE, and we're told that he was buried in Jerusalem, the city of David, his father, which Solomon had expanded magnificently. The people that compiled the Hebrew Bible depicted Solomon as an exceedingly wise, exceptionally wealthy, and extremely powerful ruler. And as mentioned, his empire is supposed to have stretched from the Euphrates River to the Egyptian frontier. In the book of Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible, the chronicler pressed these claims even further, neutralizing any negative aspects from Solomon's reign and elaborating on his role as builder of the famous temple in Jerusalem and co-founder with his father David of the Israelite religion and the cult at Jerusalem. And various things in the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and even the Song of Songs appear to credit Solomon for their wisdom. So it's not surprising that his reign later came to be regarded as the epitome of splendor and opulence and even wise government. But a careful examination of the biblical text, probing beneath the sweeping generalizations, reveals certain ironies. For example, wealthy Solomon developed cash flow problems. Powerful Solomon was troubled by adversaries very close to home. And wise Solomon apparently exploited his people through forced labor and other practices of a despot that the bulk of his kingdom chose to break away after his death. So we have a rather interesting situation. Now, Solomon's reign is among the first when we can actually try and tie something specifically in the Bible to something specifically in the archaeological record. Namely, in the first book of Kings, 1 Kings 9, it mentions several cities that Solomon built or fortified, including Jerusalem and Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And archaeological excavations at these sites, all four of them, have revealed layers of building and fortification remains that were dated to Solomon's reign and which do in fact suggest, both by their large scale and their similar design, that they were centralized, a royal building program perhaps. So we may have, on the one hand, material evidence of Solomon's accomplishments as a builder. On the other hand, that same evidence shows that his accomplishments were rather modest when you compare them to the kings of Egypt or the great kings of Mesopotamia. So let us take a look then in detail at Solomon, both his tradition and his history, and then see if we can tie it to anything in the archaeological record. Now, as mentioned, Solomon is particularly known for his wealth, his women, and his wisdom. We're told in 1 Kings, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. And of course we're told the story of the two women who both claimed that the infant was theirs, and Solomon said, "We'll cut the child in half, and you can each have a half." And the mother said, "No, no, no, let him be. The other woman can have it." Solomon in his wisdom realized that only a mother would rather give up her child than have it cut in half. And so he gave the child to the proper mother. So Solomon's wisdom has come down through the ages. Solomon is also known for his wives, and we're told again in the book of 1 Kings, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, the daughter of Pharaoh, and Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart." So we're told that he had a total of 1,000 wives and concubines, and that these women turned his heart after other gods. And indeed we're told that he built sanctuaries to the gods of the Moabites and the Ammonites respectively, and therefore God became angry with Solomon and sent adversaries. We are also told of Solomon's wealth, that he had an abundance of silver and gold. And in 1 Kings we're told, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that which came from the traders and from the traffic of the merchants, and from all the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the land. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went into each shield. The king also made a great ivory throne, and overlaid it with the finest gold. So our sources come from 1 Kings for the most part. We're also told of the Queen of Sheba coming to visit, and various other things as well. In fact, the Queen of Sheba may be Solomon's lasting claim to fame. She exchanged costly gifts with him, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, overall, our discussions of the biblical and the archaeological materials that pertain to Solomon lead us to a couple of conclusions. First, the biblical account in Genesis through 2 Kings serves as our primary source of information, just as it has for all the earlier periods of biblical history that we've been talking about. The account given by the chronicler in the Hebrew Bible is of no real help, nor is there much of consequence that can be found about Solomon from any other biblical sources. Another item to point out is that the presentation in the Hebrew Bible consists largely of extended descriptions of Solomon's cultic activities and sweeping claims about his great wealth and wisdom and international prestige, so that when you probe beneath these, as we've mentioned, you get rather disappointing results, and the meager information that we've got today simply does not support the sweeping claims. And it is upon this that biblical minimalists and others have seized to claim that the account of Solomon in the Hebrew Bible actually bears no relation to the reality of the archaeological record. Now, if we begin to read between the lines, it seems pretty obvious that Solomon inherited a kingdom from David that was not unified in any means. And the fact that he was able to hold the kingdom together throughout his reign was one of his major accomplishments, and yet for this he doesn't get much praise. The trend that started under David of a Jerusalem-based kingdom reached full development under Solomon. He probably was wealthy and powerful, at least by the standards of the time, that is the early first millennium BCE. But even so, he should probably be regarded more as a local ruler over an expanded city-state rather than a world-class emperor like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, to whom he probably doesn't really compare. He engaged in the usual royal pursuits, building programs, commercial ventures, patronage of literature, and whether he was wise or not was probably something to be discussed even in his own day. And like many of the kings of his day and afterward, Solomon had international contacts, and in this context we would probably put the visit of the Queen of Sheba, if indeed it ever took place. We're told in 1 Kings, now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices, and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind, and Solomon answered all of her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king which he could not explain to her. So the story, taken at face value, is that Sheba came to visit Solomon because of his wealth and wisdom, and we may well accept that at face value or say it is simply a story that reflects the international connections that undoubtedly he could well have had at that time. Now, overall, Solomon is regarded as a peaceful king, and indeed he seems to have been so. We know of no clashes, military or otherwise, with foreign powers during his reign. The achievements that are credited to him lie mostly in the religious, economic, and cultural spheres. He completed the temple at Jerusalem, erected buildings in other cities, set up fortresses, made trade alliances and economic treaties with neighboring countries. On the whole, he might not have been as vigorous or creative as David, but he did piece together and put together the empire. Now, Solomon had inherited this kingdom. He inherited it from his father David, and he managed to keep control of it by various diplomatic connections. He developed and sustained these in various ways, and one of these is his wives. One of the reasons why I don't necessarily question the fact that he could have had 1,000 wives and concubines is because at that time in history, it was very common to seal a diplomatic treaty between two powers by marrying each other's daughters. That is, you put together some kind of diplomatic treaty, and in order to cement it, make sure either side follows it, each king would then marry the daughter of the other king. So a lot of the women that we see in Solomon's palace may well have gotten there because of the various peace treaties that he signed with his neighbors, with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, the Hittites. It's very easy to see the background of foreign politics as underlying all of these marriages, because these are women of the very countries that Solomon would wish to have been at peace with, both right around his country and further beyond. And in particular, the daughter of the king of Egypt, who Solomon marries, plays a pretty prominent role. She's mentioned about 5 different times, and this confirms that he wanted to be friends with Egypt. So he also then cultivated extensive trade relationships, sends voyages to the land of Ophir that bring back gold and valuable wood and other luxuries. And since his Israelites were not seafarers themselves, he is supported in this by the king of Tyre. That is the king from the coast of Lebanon, where we've seen the Phoenicians were already, and in fact these would indeed be Phoenician seafarers that are helping out King Solomon. The king of Tyre, we're told in the book of 1 Kings, put shipwrights and sailors at his disposal, and Solomon had the city of Etzion-Geber constructed as a harbor for his fleet on the northern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. And excavations has confirmed that the city, which has been found, may indeed have been begun by Solomon. Now, it's often said of this peaceful era that this is the time when Israel made associations with the international world, when it became open to the spirit of the age. Arts and learning flourished, great buildings were erected, literature was collected. But where did it take place? Well, it took place in Jerusalem, and really nowhere else. So it really is at Solomon's court that his enlightenment and wisdom had its greatest effect. But still, as we say, this whole development must be seen in fairly modest terms within a small area. It is now very highly doubted that the empire stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates. More likely it was about the bounds of the modern state of Israel as it exists now, if even that. Now, this age of Solomon should not be underestimated, but it should be appreciated because immediately upon his death, violent conflicts broke out, and the united monarchy is going to split into the divided kingdoms. The city with which Solomon's name is forever linked is the city of Jerusalem, even though little or nothing of what he built there has actually been identified by archaeologists. In terms of Solomon's temple and Solomon's palace, we are told that they were built to the north of the Jebusite city, that city that David had captured. The Jebusite city was on the southernmost part of this eastern ridge. Solomon then built up the northern part of that eastern ridge, and this is where the Temple Mount lies today. It was not easy to build there. It was a very narrow ridge. Solomon's workmen and his architects, his construction engineers, would have been hard-pressed to build up in that area. Nevertheless, they did manage, and we are told that the temple, the famous Temple of Solomon, was built on this northern part of the eastern ridge, some 230 meters to the north of the city of David. That would be, let's see, about 750 feet or so to the north of the Jebusite city, joined the two of them by a narrow strip. But again, I should say that none of this has been substantially confirmed by archaeology, in part because this city has been built and rebuilt so many times over the last couple of thousand years. The one thing that we do know for sure is that the Temple Mount, upon which Solomon's temple was built, is now today the home of the Dome of the Rock, sacred to Islam, up on the Haram el-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, as it is known to Islam. And it is this particular area that is the center of the battles that have been fought for Jerusalem over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. Marin Benveniste, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, once said that the Temple Mount is a time bomb of apocalyptic dimensions. And this is quite agreeable with me. This I would not contest, and I would in fact agree also with Gershom Gorenberg, the author of the End of Days book, in which he says that the Temple Mount is the most contested piece of real estate on earth, and that, without a doubt, it is. So all this begins, in fact, well before the time of Solomon. In fact, the Temple Mount was probably already a Canaanite high place back in the 3rd millennium BCE, and then, having been taken over by David and then by Solomon and onwards up to the present day, we're probably looking at 4,000 or 5,000 years of continuous religious worship up on top of the Temple Mount, which may make it the oldest piece of real estate in the world to have a continuous religious presence up on top, going from Canaanite pagan ritual to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and on to today. It is up on top of this area that we find the rock that we have mentioned before, the rock on which Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and also this rock on which Muhammad ascended to heaven on his nocturnal journey. And today, if you go look at the rock inside of the Dome of the Rock, if you can get in, your tour guide will point to a couple of indentations in the rock, and depending on the story that he or she tells you, will say either these are the marks made by the legs of the Ark of the Covenant, or these are the marks made by Muhammad's horse or steed as he leaped up to the heavens, or by the ladder as he climbed up to the heavens. So this one area on the Temple Mount, the Haram el-Sharif, is now sacred to 3 of the world's major religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Well, this all then begins in terms of building practices with Solomon. He is the one that puts the temple up on top, and we are given detailed descriptions of Solomon's temple, both in the book of Kings and the book of 2nd Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible. And to these we can add the first-hand evidence of Ezekiel, but unfortunately we don't know all the details. We're told that the temple was begun in the 4th year of Solomon's 40-year-long reign, and that this was also the 480th year after the Exodus from Egypt, as you may remember. Solomon's building projects took exactly half his reign, we're told, 20 years, and of those 20 years, 7 years of that time was devoted to the building of the temple. The problem here, we have symbolic numbers. 4, 40, multiples of 40, and 7, and we may not want to take these numbers literally. Suffice it to say that we are told that Solomon builds the temple, and it takes a fair amount of time and probably a great deal of money. Well, when Solomon begins to build the temple, Hiram, the king of Tyre, agrees to supply building materials and skilled workmen. Solomon himself raises a levy of forced labor for the project, and so it begins. There is an elaborate description of the temple, and we are told altogether between the building of the temple and the palace and associated royal buildings that we've got 20 years in all. In addition, we're told that Solomon hired a bronzesmith from Tyre who made bronze fixtures and furnishings for the temple. And when all the work was completed, Solomon stored in the temple all the things that David had dedicated, silver, gold, and vessels, including the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the description of bringing the Ark into the temple and of dedicating the temple to God, we're told the dedication ceremony included the ritual transfer of the Ark into the temple, and then a long prayer by Solomon, in which he called upon God to reconfirm his promise to David, to bless the temple with his presence and to forgive the people. then elaborate sacrifices and peace offerings, followed by a great feast. And after the people returned back to their homes, God appeared to Solomon and assured him that his prayer would be answered depending upon the king's faithfulness. We are then told a number of other items that seem to be appended into the text at this point, and they pertain in one way or another to the completion of the building program. Solomon gives 20 cities to Hiram of Tyre in payment for everything that Hiram had contributed. We are told that the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh is moved to her own house. We are told that Solomon built the Millo, M-I-L-L-O, though we don't actually know what the Millo is, and that Solomon then began to offer burnt offerings and peace offerings in the temple 3 times a year. Now, the temple itself presents a bit of a puzzle. In part, the biblical description of the temple is not entirely clear and can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And related to this is the origin of the architecture. Where did Solomon get his idea for the temple and what the temple was supposed to look like? It seems a bit strange that the Bible's description of the temple is fairly inexact, especially because the furniture and the utensils inside are described in minute detail. So the building itself lacks all detail except for a little brief notice concerning its windows, and we don't know why this is. We also get other aspects that are given in excruciating detail. Doors to the inner sanctuary are made of olive wood carved in relief, with palm trees and open flowers overlain with gold. Side chambers are described extensively, and so on and so forth. Now, we do know that the temple is not the only building in the temple compound. It's simply the central structure. And so we have arguments still ongoing as to exactly what the building looked like. What is of importance is that Solomon's temple seems to have been of the type that we call a long room temple. A long room temple is one that is oriented with the entrance on the short side and the shrine at the opposite end of the building. That is, it would have been a long and narrow temple, and you would have entered on one of the short sides and walked the length of the building to get to the Holy of Holies or the shrine at the other end. Now, this type of building is not uncommon. You can find it in any number of countries, in Syria and elsewhere, also in Greece. And one can, in fact, trace this type of temple back to the so-called Megaron type of building found in Turkey and in Greece in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. Solomon's temple seems to have been made up in 3 parts. There's a porch at the front with 2 freestanding columns. From here you would pass into the main hall or sanctuary, and then at the far end was the inner sanctuary, known as the Holy of Holies. This was where the Ark of the Covenant would have been kept. What we're not sure about are the exact dimensions of the temple. One scholar claims that the Bible says the temple was 60 cubits long. That would be about 103 feet long, and 20 cubits, or 33 feet wide, and 30 cubits, or 51 feet high. Other scholars say that the whole thing was about 100 cubits long by 50 cubits wide. That would be 150 by 75 feet, but that, yes, it was about 30 cubits or 50 feet high. Now, we can't, of course, examine the temple and decide for ourselves because Solomon's temple was destroyed in the year 586 by the armies of the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, as we will discuss in a future lecture. What we can talk about, though, is the fact that this type of a temple is completely unlike the indigenous Israelite temples which existed at that time. The indigenous Israelite temples are what we call a broad room temple, as opposed to the long room temple. If you remember, Solomon's temple is a long room temple, a long and narrow temple which you entered on the short side. A broad room temple is exactly what it sounds like, that the room is much broader. It's almost, well, it's not a square, but it's closer to it than the long room would be, and that you entered on one of the broad sides. So it looks completely different. It's much more of a rectangle, more like a square than Solomon's temple would have looked like. So what we're wondering is why Solomon did not follow the more usual Israelite temple plan and indeed built something that looked more like you would find up in North Syria or elsewhere. And what we probably can say is that when it came time for him to build a house for God, and when it came time for him to build the temple, rather than looking at the Israelite prototypes, he looked to Phoenician examples, and the Phoenician examples trace themselves back to these long room temples in North Syria and even back to Turkey and over to Greece. The fact that Hiram of Tyre from Phoenicia is helping Solomon probably had an awful lot to do with it. So we find Solomon's temple looking a lot like a Phoenician temple rather than an Israelite temple. We should also mention here the fact that Solomon's temple is still relevant today because it is entering into modern-day politics. And I would cite as recently as the year 2000 when Yasser Arafat at Camp David declared to Barack and Clinton, quote, "The temple didn't exist in Jerusalem, it existed in Nablus. There is nothing there, that is, there is no trace of a temple on the Temple Mount," end quote. And Arafat repeated this to Jacques Chirac when he visited France in September of 2000, saying, quote, "The ruins of the temple don't exist. Our studies show that these are actually Greek and Roman ruins," end quote. And others have weighed in on this similarly. Now, here, again, this is pure politics. Benny Morris of Ben-Gurion University has stated that Arafat's denial of the Jewish temple is a microcosm of his denial of the Jews' claim to the land of Israel. In point of fact, there has been very little, if anything, found of Solomon's temple, but this should not be surprising. The Temple Mount has been built upon for the last 3,000 years, and the Dome of the Rock is standing there right now. So, pointing to the lack of archaeological evidence is not a very good precedent. What is of greater relevance is the fact that when Jerusalem came under Islamic control in the 7th century CE, that Islam's own early names for Jerusalem were Medinet Bayt al-Maqdis, or the city of the temple, or simply Bayt al-Maqdis, the temple, or the holy house. So any statements by Yasser Arafat and others concerning the non-existence of the temple in Jerusalem are directly contradicted by Islam's own early names for Jerusalem, which stated that there was a holy house or a temple right there. Now, next to the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon builds a palace. This, too, is described in great detail in the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible, and it included units like the House of the Forest of Lebanon, the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of the Throne, where Solomon, was to pronounce judgment, and so on and so forth. There have been a number of similar palaces that have been discovered at Megiddo and other cities, but the palace of Solomon at Jerusalem has not yet been discovered. However, there is one passage in particular from the Hebrew Bible that has long attracted the attention of archaeologists. In the Book of Kings, we are told, and I quote, "And this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord and his own house, and the Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, and Megiddo, and Gezer." And indeed, archaeological excavations at Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer have uncovered architecture that was dated to the time of Solomon. Thus, Gezer and Hatzor and Megiddo have become popularly known as Solomon's royal cities. And indeed, each of these cities are strategically sited and situated to command important areas within the kingdom. Hatzor's in the Jordan Valley, Megiddo's in the Jezreel Valley, and Gezer is at the foot of the hill country, commanding a route that passed up the coast. All of these have been very powerful Canaanite city-states, but for now had passed into the hands of Solomon. And at each of these cities, there have been gates found, multi-chambered gates. There is a so-called Solomonic gate found at Hatzor, a Solomonic gate found at Megiddo, and a Solomonic gate found at Gezer. And so archaeologists for the longest time said that we had kind of a global blueprint that was used by Solomon's architects that they followed at each of his cities. This is now coming under attack and under fire, and it seems now that all of these gateways may not, in fact, date to the time of Solomon, but in fact may be anywhere from 100 to 200 years later, at the very least that they may well date to the period of the divided kingdoms, that is, during the later part of the Iron Age. So all of this now brings us back to the present, where not only David but Solomon is under attack, and the whole question of the biblical account, which we have been walking through in this lecture, is again under some question, shall we put it that way. The whole account of Solomon as recorded in the Hebrew Bible has now been called into question. How much can we believe? This is as yet unknown. But archaeology here again should be able to provide us some details. In our future lecture, we'll take a look at two objects that were usually called Solomon's stables and Solomon's palace at the site of Megiddo. Both of these have been redated now to the time of the kingdom of Omry, or even later during the divided kingdom periods in Israel and Judah. It is to this period of the divided monarchy that we will return after a brief excursus to look specifically at the Ark of the Covenant, which we shall do in this next lecture.
After listening to Lecture 5, a student posed this question to Professor Klein. If archaeologists had unlimited access to the Temple Mount, what would they find?
If archaeologists were allowed unrestricted access to the Temple Mount, and we were able to dig up whatever we wanted, wherever we wanted, with, of course, precise recording as we went, I think we would be absolutely astonished by what we found there. I believe not only would we find evidence for Solomon's temple up on top of the Temple Mount, but also evidence for Herod's temple and everything in between, plus afterward. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all three religions are going to find something of interest to them up there. Unfortunately, this will never happen. There will not be any digging up on top, not legal digging in the near future, and so this area will remain off limits to archaeology for the foreseeable future.
This ends Lecture 5. A History of Ancient Israel, Lecture 6, The Ark of the Covenant.
In this lecture, we'll take a look at the Ark of the Covenant, that object made famous by Harrison Ford and Raiders of the Lost Ark. We'll take a look in part at what exactly was the Ark of the Covenant and where is it now. The Ark of the Covenant, considered to be the most holy and powerful object described in the Hebrew Bible, measured only 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits. In other words, 4 foot 2 inches long by 2 feet 6 inches wide and 2 feet 6 inches high. Not a very big object. The description of the Ark of the Covenant is found in Exodus 25, lines 10 through 22. They shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, 1 cubit and a half its breadth, and 1 cubit and a half its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold. Within and without shall you overlay it, and you shall make upon it a molding of gold round about. And you shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them on its 4 feet, 2 rings on the one side of it, and 2 rings on the other side of it. You shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. And you shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony which I shall give you. Then you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, and 1 cubit and a half its breadth. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, of hammered work shall you make them, on the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub on the one end, and 1 cherub on the other end. Of one piece with the mercy seat shall you make the cherubim on its two ends. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces one to another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim be. And you shall put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are upon the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you of all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. So, that's the ark. Not very big, but with a precise description of exactly what it looked like. What was it that was in the ark? There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there, the 2 tablets with which God made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt, book of 1 Kings. It's first mentioned in Exodus 25 that the tablets of the law, which were given to Moses upon Mount Sinai, were put into the Ark of the Covenant. And this is what gave it its power, the fact that the laws, the 10 Commandments, were inside. We're told that many great deeds were performed with the ark as it traveled in front of the army, including in the book of Joshua, Joshua 6, where it says that Jericho's wall came tumbling down after the ark was carried around it for 7 times. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." And as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while the trumpets blew continually. One of the more intriguing things to do with the ark is to try and follow its journeys as you read through the Hebrew Bible. If you do so, the journey would look something like this. The ark was first kept at the city of Shiloh. We're told this in Joshua 18 and the book of 1 Samuel 3. And it accompanied the Israelite army into battle. Once it fell into the hands of the Philistines near the town of Ebenezer, probably Aphek. We're told this in 1 Samuel. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "A god has come into the camp." And so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled, every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was captured, and the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. Once the Philistines had the ark in their possession, they took it to Ashdod, and then to Gath, and then to Ekron, 3 of their 5 cities, as we've mentioned in a past lecture. We're told this in the book of 1 Samuel. When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they carried it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon, and set it up beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. But when the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, "They have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to slay us and our people." They sent therefore and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines, and said, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it return to its own place, that it may not slay us and our people." For there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were stricken with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Since Shiloh had been destroyed, the ark then moved on. We're told this in Jeremiah 26 and in Psalms 78. When God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among men, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people over to the sword, and vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men, and their maidens had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. So the ark was returned to Beth-Shemesh. 1 Samuel. Now the people of Beth-Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and when they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, they rejoiced to see it. The cart came into the field of Joshua of Beth-Shemesh, and stopped there. A great stone was there, and they split up the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the Levites came down to the ark of the Lord, and the box that was beside it, in which were the golden figures, and set them upon the great stone. And the men of Beth-Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrificed sacrifices on that day to the Lord. And the ark remained there in Beth-Shemesh until a plague made necessary its transfer to Abinadab's house on the hill in Kiriath-Jearim. Again we get the story in 1 Samuel. And the men of Kiriath-Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. From the day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath-Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. Then comes David. David moves the ark to Jerusalem, where it was first placed in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. We're told this in the book of 2 Samuel. And they carried the ark of God upon a new cart, and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres, and harps and tambourines, and castanets and cymbals. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, How can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Finally, it was then moved into a special tent within Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 6 says, So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. And then, finally, the ark came to rest in a special permanent place in the Holy of Holies within the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. 1 Kings 8 tells us, And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. And they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent, the priests and the Levites brought them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. So in sum, the travels of the ark go from Shiloh to Aphek, to Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, then to Gath and Ekron, then Beth-Shemesh, then to Kiriath-Jearim, and then finally to Jerusalem, where it stays. Quite the travels over quite a number of years. So, if the ark ended up in Solomon's temple, where is it now? After the ark is moved into Solomon's temple, there is no further mention of it being carried to war or at festivals. Some scholars, basing their views on the fact that the ark is not mentioned among the vessels that were carried off into exile, or even brought back from Babylonia in the 6th century BC, suggests that the ark was no longer in Solomon's temple at the time that the temple and indeed the entire city of Jerusalem were destroyed by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE. So the ark disappeared sometime between Solomon's time, let's say 930 BCE, and the time that the city is destroyed in 586 BCE. But when and exactly what happened? The book of 2nd Esdras, which is not found in many Bibles today, only in Bibles that contain the Apocrypha, books that did not make it into the regular Bible, the book of 2nd Esdras implies that the ark was destroyed. The author, who is lamenting over the fall of Jerusalem in 586, says, quote, "Our sanctuary is laid waste. Our altar is broken down. Our temple is destroyed. The ark of our covenant is spoiled." So one of the possibilities is that the ark was simply melted down. Another possibility is that it was captured and carried off, but if that happened, we have no record of it. There is a passage in the Talmud which says that the ark was hidden by King Josiah. Josiah was king in Judah from 639 to 609 BCE. We'll see him in a future lecture. And this passage in the Talmud says that Josiah hid the ark, quote, "in its place," end quote, or beneath the woodshed. Now we have no indication where this might be. In its place, under or beneath the woodshed, that could mean anything. But according to the Talmud then, Josiah hid the ark. This would have been less than 10 or 15 years before the destruction of the city by the Babylonians. And it is this statement in the Talmud that has led to a popular theory that the ark's present location is in a secret chamber carved deep beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And indeed, there are probably chambers underneath the Temple Mount, but no one has been allowed to go into them in recent time. Some ultra-Orthodox claim that the ark is indeed under the Temple Mount and will be revealed at the proper time, that is, when the temple is rebuilt on top of the Temple Mount. However, there are stories circulating that when the present tunnel that runs along the western wall, and in which you can see remnants of Herod's building projects, when that tunnel was being excavated, 2 rabbis, along with some of their students, went in to see if they could find the ark. And in the course of these investigations, they noticed water seeping from the wall. They removed a stone. Now remember, this is some 30 feet underneath the present day of Jerusalem's walls. They moved a stone, revealed a vaulted chamber, and from here discovered another lower chamber, and in this lower chamber would be the Ark of the Covenant along with other objects. Unfortunately, supposedly the authorities got wind of these investigations and sealed up the entrances to these caves, and there are no photographs, nor drawings, nor anything else of these views that the people saw. And this is a common theme. Anybody that has claimed to have discovered the Ark of the Covenant, without exception, has then been unable to produce evidence that they've actually found it. No photographs, no drawings, no nothing. Now, numerous people have claimed that they found or that they know where the Ark is, perhaps elsewhere in Jerusalem. This includes people like Ron Wyatt, who has discovered Noah's Ark, Sodom and Gomorrah, the parting of the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, how the pyramids were built, and the Ark of the Covenant. He claims to have discovered the location of the Ark of the Covenant, and in 1979 began excavations with his sons to go find the Ark of the Covenant. Ron Wyatt has a website on which he gives the story of how he discovered the Ark of the Covenant. And it says, and I quote from the website, "While waiting in Jerusalem for his return flight to the United States, Ron was walking along an ancient stone quarry known to some as the Calvary Escarpment. As he began walking, he began conversing with a local authority about Roman antiquities. At one point, they stopped walking, and Ron's left hand pointed to a site being used as a trash dump, and he stated, "That's Jeremiah's grotto, and the Ark of the Covenant is in there." Even though these words had come from his own mouth and his own hand had pointed, he had not consciously done or said these things. In fact, it was the first time he had ever thought about excavating for the Ark. Now, according to this website, Ron Wyatt's theory is that the Ark of the Covenant was hidden just prior to the destruction of the temple, when the city was surrounded by the Babylonian siege wall. The Ark of the Covenant was hidden somewhere within the confines of the city wall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian siege wall. The entire city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, so the Ark could only have escaped destruction or captivity by not being anywhere in the city. The site that Ron had pointed to was, he believed, outside of the ancient city wall, but within the siege wall. Two non-biblical sources state that the sacred objects from the temple were hidden by Jeremiah before the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. So Ron's conclusion was supposition based on study, but still only supposition. Yet it was enough to base a decision on. He decided to go ahead with the excavation. Again, I'm quoting from his website. So the excavation then began in January of 1979. Ron Wyatt and his sons Ronnie and Danny returned to Jerusalem and began their excavations. They eventually removed many tons of rock and debris, sifting through all of it for artifacts. This was a requirement of the Department of Antiquities with which they were happy to comply. By 1980, Ron and the boys had been working here for almost 2 years. They had begun in January of 1979, and it was now late 1980. They had explored the entire underground cliff face, looking for an entrance into a cave or a tunnel. If the Ark was in that location, it certainly would be hidden in a cave, he reasoned. With hammers and chisels, they began their work. It wasn't long before they broke through the rock into an open space. Enlarging the hole, they saw behind it a cave, which was about 15 feet in height and of about the same width. Crawling through, they were finally inside the actual mountain called Moriah. Elsewhere on his website, Wyatt records, and I quote, "Shining his flashlight down through the massive pile of large rocks, his eyes caught a glimpse of something shiny. He began slowly removing the rocks one at a time and discovered some dry-rotted wooden timbers just beneath the rocks, and then some also dry-rotted remains of animal skins that turned to powder when he moved them. Animal skins were covering a gold-veneered table with a raised molding around the side, and they realized that this was, at the very least, an object from Solomon's temple. But they were in such a confined space they couldn't uncover the entire table, and yet they are confident that in that chamber they saw the Ark of the Covenant, the table of shewbread, golden altar of incense, golden censer, 7-branched candlestick holder, a large sword, a mitre with an ivory pomegranate, a brass ring, and so on. Unfortunately, they were not able to bring out any of the objects, nor are there any photographs of what they found. Another favorite suggestion for the location of the Ark of the Covenant is Mount Nebo in Jordan, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, since the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is also part of the Apocrypha and not usually included in the Bible, says that Jeremiah hid the Ark of the Covenant on Mount Nebo. It was also in the writing that the prophet Jeremiah, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent and the ark should follow with him, and that he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God. And Jeremiah came, and he found a cave, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense, and he sealed up the entrance. Some of those who followed him came up to mark the way, but could not find it. When Jeremiah learned of it, he rebuked them and declared, "The place shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy." And so some people have gone to look for the ark. For example, in the autumn of 1981, Tom Krotzer and his team from the Institute for Restoring Ancient History went to the Franciscan monastery on the summit of Mount Nebo, which owned the property where they thought the ark was located. They said that they found a plaque inside the chapel which indicated that the Ark of the Lord was buried there. And so at night they entered a tunnel which was 35 feet long and 4 feet wide. At the end of the tunnel they ran into a wall. After knocking the stones down, they entered one by one into a small cave, about 10 feet by 12 feet. And by the light of their flashlights, they were able to make out a large object covered with blue material. Under the covering, they could see a golden box, which they did not touch because they remembered what had happened to others who had dared to touch the sacred box. Namely, they were killed when they touched it. So they simply photographed the box and then withdrew. Asked later why he didn't bring out the Ark of the Covenant to show the world, they replied, "God sent us only to locate the Ark. They were not to open it, nor were they to bring it out." An archaeologist looked at the photographs that they took. He only found one of them to be at all clear. And that photograph depicted a yellow box that appeared to be made out of brass and which had a very modern-looking nail protruding from one corner. Others have suggested that the Ark is hidden somewhere near the Dead Sea on Jordan's west bank. This is usually considered in association with Qumran and the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll take a look at in a future lecture. If this is so, then the Ark and the other artifacts are buried in one of the region's many caves, much like the Dead Sea Scrolls. In particular, one explorer, Vendell Jones, is convinced that the Ark is in one of the Dead Sea caves, based on information that's contained in the so-called Copper Scroll, which we will take a look at in a future lecture. Since 1972, Vendell Jones has conducted 8 major excavations in and around Qumran, involving over 300 volunteers and an investment of nearly $2 million, but they have yet to find the Ark. Interestingly, the thesis that we find in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that the Ark was taken by Pharaoh Shishak and is at the site of Tanis in Egypt, is not a popular view today. This is probably because there are a lack of traditions saying that the Ark is down in Egypt. On the other hand, there is a tradition which suggests that the Ark may be in Ethiopia. Journalist Graham Hancock, in particular in his book The Sign and the Seal, says that the Queen of Sheba and Solomon had a son. In his book he relates this tradition, and that this son went to Ethiopia and with him brought the Ark. This is the man named Menelik. When he went to Ethiopia, he took the Ark with him, and that it eventually reached the site of Axum in Ethiopia. Others have tried to follow this as well, getting to Ethiopia, and have traced this movement of the Ark to one particular church, but nobody is allowed in to see the Ark, if indeed it exists in there. Of course, as we all know, and as the first Indiana Jones movie informed us, the Ark is in a government warehouse somewhere in Washington, D.C., being worked on by experts at this very moment. With that in mind, let us now proceed to our next lecture, in which we will take up the discussion of the divided monarchy, that is the period after Solomon, when Israel and Judah break into separate kingdoms in the north and the south, and proceed upon very different histories. We will begin first with the northern kingdom of Israel.
After listening to Lecture 6, a student posed this question to Professor Klein. What are your personal thoughts about the search for the Ark of the Covenant? Let's listen to the professor's response.
My own personal take on all of this, on all of the search for the Ark of the Covenant, is frankly that it is a waste of time, money, energy, and resources. If the Ark ever did exist, as it's described in the Hebrew Bible, it is now long gone. Most likely, I believe, it was captured by somebody when they destroyed or besieged Jerusalem. Remember that Jerusalem has been fought over more than 100 times in the last 4,000 years, and we have any number of instances where the treasures of the temple were looted. The Roman general Titus, when he destroyed the city in 70 CE, as we shall see in a future lecture, gets all the bad press for taking the stuff out of the temple, but it had been done many times before. In fact, the treasures of the temple had either been looted or borrowed from no fewer than 17 or 18 times during its 1,000-year history of existence, from the time of Solomon right through Herod. So I would have no trouble believing that one or another of the conquerors of Jerusalem, or even just somebody that was attacking it, would have acquired the ark, and then it would be captured, taken away, melted down, or otherwise destroyed. Either way, it's not going to be around for us to find today. We certainly know that it is gone by 586 BCE because Nebuchadnezzar does not mention it in the list of treasures that he took away from Jerusalem. And believe me, if the ark had still been in Jerusalem at that time, Nebuchadnezzar would certainly have mentioned it. So it disappears somewhere between 930 BCE and 586 BCE, and I can think of any number of people that could have taken it. First and foremost among them would be Shishak, he whom Raiders of the Lost Ark wants to have the ark taken off to Tanis, and this makes a lot of sense to me. But what it boils down to is that this is one of the searches, like a search for the Holy Grail or anything else of that ilk, that it is probably doomed to failure. Any such expedition is doomed to failure, and frankly, what I would rather see is that the effort and the time, and especially the money, could be put to much better use by using them for real excavations, that is, excavating at Hatzor or Megiddo or Afek or Safi or Gath, any of the real excavations that are ongoing today that can use time, money, and commitment, and that are not searching for a needle in the proverbial haystack. So, like the search for Noah's Ark, I think the search for the Ark of the Covenant is almost always going to be doomed to failure, and I would much rather see everything be put into real excavations. Of course, if the ark is ever found, I'll be content to eat my words, but I don't really think that is going to happen anytime in the near future.
This ends Lecture 6. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399 and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply. A History of Ancient Israel, Lecture 7. The Kingdom of Israel and the Omrid Dynasty.
In this lecture, we'll take a look at the Kingdom of Israel and the Omrid Dynasty. In fact, this entire section now we are going to be looking at the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, because following the death of King Solomon, the united monarchy dissolved and split into the divided kingdoms of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The Omrid dynasty was the most infamous family to rule Israel, especially in the view of the biblical writers. But then the expansionist ambitions of the Neo-Assyrians from Mesopotamia in the 8th century BCE spell an end to the kingdom of Israel and gave rise to the tradition of the 10 lost tribes. It is these topics with which we will be dealing in this lecture. When Solomon dies, his successor comes to the throne, his son Rehoboam, and in his rule, in the rule of Rehoboam, the first theme, or rather the first question that he faces, is whether or not he can hold the kingdom together. That is quickly answered when the north breaks away. The Israelites in the north declare emphatically, "Your father, Solomon, made our yoke too hard." When the Israelites in the north asked Rehoboam to lighten the burden or the load that Solomon had imposed on them, Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think about it. And then he took counsel with his closest advisors. Rather than decreasing the burden on the north, he increased it. And so what happened next is no surprise. The northern tribes of Israel break away, and we get the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And thus, the Jerusalem-based kingdom, which had been established by David and held together by Solomon, splits apart following Solomon's death in about the year 930 BCE. In its place, we get 2 small kingdoms, that are going to exist alongside each other for approximately 200 years. The northern kingdom reverts to the name Israel, is centered in the hill country north of Jerusalem. The southern kingdom, which took the name Judah, was centered in the southern hill country, encompassing Jerusalem and extending southward to the Negev. So this was the end of the personal union that was achieved by David and Solomon. The two city-states of Judah and Israel broke apart, and there is no serious attempt to reestablish their union. In part, this is not too surprising, because it was the sheer force of personality, one could argue, of both David and Solomon that had held them together for so long. So the golden age of Israel was less than a century. And after that, after this period, we have to discuss the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah separately. In this lecture, we will focus in on the northern kingdom of Israel. But the two do remain linked. Rehoboam went back to Jerusalem, and the Israelites made Jeroboam king of Israel. We are then told that the Pharaoh of Egypt came up to campaign. The biblical story tells us about the Egyptian Pharaoh Shishak, who came up and besieged Jerusalem. The Egyptian accounts, the extra-biblical accounts, talk about a pharaoh named Shoshank. Note the similarity between Shishak and Shoshank. And these Egyptian records put up by Shoshank say that he went up and campaigned, but not necessarily against Jerusalem, rather against the northern kingdom of Israel. Now we know a lot about Pharaoh Shoshank, mostly from his own records down in Egypt. He was Libyan. He was a Libyan mercenary who founded the 22nd dynasty of Egypt and ruled from about 945 down to 923 BCE. So he comes to the throne towards the end of Solomon's rule and at the beginning of the rule of Rehoboam of Judah and Jeroboam of Israel, those two both coming to the throne after the death of Solomon. Shoshank left behind on the wall of a temple in Karnak, down in Egypt, an impressive list of cities that he claims to have captured. In fact, the cities are all located in the region that we would call Israel and Judah. According to this inscription, not only the city of Megiddo, but also Tanakh and Shunem and other cities in the Jezreel Valley, along with a large number of additional towns in Israel and the Negev, fall victim one after another to the victorious Egyptian army. In other words, Shoshank's campaign to the lands of Israel and Judah, hard on the heels of the death of Solomon, would indicate that he had been waiting for Solomon to die, and that the splitting of the kingdoms into Israel and Judah were in fact to his benefit. His campaign in the lands of Israel and Judah were probably an attempt to recapture some of the earlier glory days of Egyptian dominance, when Canaan was regarded as belonging to the Egyptian Empire. However, since one cannot always believe the evidence put forward by Egyptian pharaohs, we should ask, is there any truth to this campaign that Shoshank records down on his temple in Egypt? In particular, did he capture Megiddo? Well, at Megiddo itself, a stone was found, part of a 10-foot tall inscription, and on that stone is carved the cartouche of Shoshank. Moreover, this type of a 10-foot tall inscription is the type that is put up at a city where the Egyptians not only captured it, but then occupied it. So, down in Egypt, Shoshank claims that he captured Megiddo, and up at Megiddo, there is a part of an inscription indicating that Shoshank did in fact capture the city. So, it looks like Shoshank is telling the truth. However, if we go a little bit further, the next question to be asked is whether this Egyptian pharaoh Shoshank, who left behind the record in Egypt, is indeed the same person as the Egyptian pharaoh Shishak, who is mentioned in the book of Kings and the book of 2 Chronicles in the Bible, who we are told fought in Judah some 5 years after the death of Solomon with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry. We are further told that the biblical Shishak besieged Jerusalem and carried away a great ransom. In 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles it says, "In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, King Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything. He also took away the shields of gold that Solomon had made." So perhaps this is when the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. Are Shoshank and Shishak the same person? Occam's razor, the simplest solution is probably the most correct, would imply yes. However, one thing that is interesting, the cities that are named in the Egyptian account are almost all from the north of Israel. The cities named in the biblical account are almost all from the southern portion, that is, from Judah. How do we explain this? Are there in fact two different Egyptian pharaohs, one who attacked Israel and one who attacked Judah at nearly the same time? Or do we have the same person attacking twice, first against Israel and then against Judah? Or do we explain it in some other way? What I would suggest is that we're looking at the exact same campaign. The biblical record is primarily concerned with events in Judah, that is, down south, but they didn't put up much of a fight. The Egyptian account emphasizes the major military events that took place, that is, up in the north, since Judah offered only minimal resistance. I think it's highly unlikely that these are records of two different campaigns, and so I think that what we've got is two different versions of the same set of military conquest. And what this means is that immediately after Solomon dies, and immediately after Rehoboam sees the split of his kingdom into the separate smaller entities of Israel and Judah, that Shishak or Shoshank comes up and wages a decisive campaign against both polities. Needless to say, this is not a good way for either smaller kingdom to begin its rise. Now, if we move specifically up to the northern kingdom of Israel, we come across a man by the name of Omry. Omry's accession to the throne of Israel in 885 BCE introduces a new era for both kingdoms, both northern Israel and southern Judah, which is going to last for about 40 years. Even though these remain separate entities, Israel and Judah enter into a close alliance and together enter a time of prosperity. And it has been recently suggested that this time of prosperity may have even surpassed the earlier days of David and Solomon. In other words, the wonderful times of ancient Israel may have been under the reign of the Omrids and all of their family. Omry himself is the chief architect of the policies that characterize the era, and it's under his son Ahab, who comes into power in 875, that the new policies come to fruition and the two kingdoms enjoy their best years. After the death of Ahab, the situation declines rapidly, and this little era comes to an abrupt end about 842 or 841 BCE with the massacre of both the royal family up in Israel and down in Judah at the hands of Jehu the usurper. We have referred to this story already when talking about the Tel Dan stele, but we'll come back to it again in a little bit. Of interest to us are the figures of Omry and Ahab from the northern kingdom of Israel, because they are the first individuals in Israelite or Judean history to be mentioned in non-biblical documents from the ancient Near East. That is, they are mentioned by other peoples and in other places outside of Israel and Judah, and so we can here finally begin to corroborate or attempt to corroborate the episodes and peoples mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Moreover, the Omrids were the first northern kings to accomplish a dynastic succession, and they did this for 3 succeeding generations. Long after they had passed from the scene, Israel is still referred to by the Assyrian monarchs as the land of Omry. Now, our information about the kingdom of Israel and about the Omrid era in particular is derived from 4 different sources. One of these sources is the Hebrew Bible. that is the Genesis to 2 Kings account. The second source is actually also in the Bible. This is the chronicler's account in the Hebrew Bible. But then we have extra-biblical evidence, the royal inscriptions from King Mesha of Moab and King Shalmaneser III of Assyria. And then, fourthly, we have archaeology. Archaeology can come into play at this point in time. We've already noted that the name Israel appears in the Merneptah stele at the end of the 13th century BCE. There are no further references in extra-biblical documents to either Israel or Judah until the period where we are now, that is, until the time of Omry and Ahab. Now, at this time, we begin to get inscriptions such as the one known as the Mesha inscription, or the Moabite stone. This is a commemorative inscription written in Moabite, which was discovered in 1868 on the east side of the Dead Sea, near the ruins of ancient Dibon. Unfortunately, the inscription was broken into pieces very soon after its discovery, but later was reconstructed almost completely. We learn from the inscription that it was commissioned by King Mesha of Moab, apparently late in his reign, and in connection with the dedication of a sanctuary to the Moabite god Chemosh. The inscription recounts the deeds of this King Mesha, who ruled Moab during the 9th century and who is in fact mentioned in the book of 2 Kings. The text looks back over Mesha's career and reports what he thought were the main accomplishments of his reign. In particular, he mentions Omry, king of Israel. It seems that Mesha was especially proud of having brought Israelite dominance over Moab to an end, and that he was additionally proud of having recovered from Israel all of the Moabite territory north of the ancient city of Madaba. In this inscription, it is written as follows: I am Mesha, son of Chemosh Yati, king of Moab, the Dibonite. My father reigned over Moab 30 years, and I reigned after my father. And I built this high place to Chemosh at Quarho, because he saved me from all the kings, and caused me to triumph over all my adversaries. Omry, king of Israel, humbled Moab many days, because Chemosh was angry at his land. And his son succeeded him, and he also said, I too will humble Moab. During my days he said this, but I have triumphed over him and over his house, and Israel has perished forever. Omry had occupied the whole land of Madaba, and he dwelt in it during his days, and half the days of his son, 40 years, but Chemosh dwelt there in my days. So Mesha mentions Omry, claims the land of Israel has perished forever. That may have been a little optimistic, but nevertheless we have here one of the first mentions of an individual from outside the Bible. We also have other inscriptions, such as the so-called monolith inscription of Shalmaneser III, which dates back to 853 BCE. These inscriptions report Assyrian activities, the Assyrians being in what is now the modern country of Iraq. And here, Shalmaneser III, who rules from 858 to 824 BCE, in the 6th year of his rule, he is going to campaign down into Israel. In fact, he not only campaigns there in his 6th year, but again in the 10th, 11th, 14th, 18th, and 21st years of his reign. We can date these, and we know that his invasions into Israel date from 853 BC on. The first campaign is described in some detail, and it is this campaign that appears in the so-called monolith inscription. It appears along with a figure of Shalmaneser himself in relief, and it was discovered way back in the mid-1800s in present-day Iraq. We learn from this monolith inscription that a coalition of kings from Israel and surrounding areas fought against Shalmaneser, and that they apparently halted his march in the vicinity of a place called Karkar, which is a city on the Orontes River. Listed among the defending kings is Ahab the Israelite, that is the son of Omry. who is credited with deploying 2,000 chariots in the battle. Listen now to the words of Shalmaneser III. I approached the city of Karkar. I razed, destroyed, and burned the city of Karkar, his royal city. 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, and 20,000 troops of Hadad-ezer of Damascus. 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, 10,000 troops of Irhulim, the Hamathite. 2,000 chariots and 10,000 troops of Ahab the Israelite. And he goes on to name a number of other people and all of their troops. And then he continues, I decisively defeated them from the city of Karkar to the city of Gilzau. I felled with the sword 14,000 troops, their fighting men. Like Adad, I rained down upon them a devastating flood. I spread out their corpses, and I filled the plain. I felled with the sword their extensive troops. I made their blood flow in the wadis. The field was too small for laying flat their bodies. The broad countryside had been consumed in burying them. I blocked the Orontes River with their corpses, as with a causeway. In the midst of this battle, I took away from them chariots, cavalry, and teams of horses. Now, the monolith inscription was composed fairly early in Shalmaneser's reign, and it doesn't cover his later campaigns. For these, we must turn to other inscriptions, which record his deeds later in his reign. For example, in something called the Black Obelisk, which dates to 838 BCE, we are told that Shalmaneser III marched all the way to Damascus in Syria with no serious opposition at this time, and that he besieged the city but doesn't actually take it. Then he marches into Israel, where he collects tribute from Jehu, the general who usurped the throne of Israel from the Omrids in about 841 BC. And here he says, and I quote, tribute of Jehu, son of Omry, silver, gold, a golden saplu bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden goblets, pitchers of gold, tin, staffs for the hand of the king, javelins I received from him. Now, Jehu is not actually the son of Omri. Jehu is the usurper who does away with the house of Omri, and yet look what's happening already. The Omrids are so famous that they are referred to, even though they're not in existence anymore, and the land of Israel is going to be referred to as the land of Omri. It is into this context, then, that we can place the Tel Dan inscription that we talked about in an earlier lecture. This is the fragment that dates to 841 BCE and was probably put up by King Hazael of Aram when he came through and destroyed this area. These are the fragments that were found in 1993 and 1994 at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel, the ones that mention the house of David, the Beit David. Now, in the other inscriptions that we just talked about, they mention individuals, Omri, Ahab, Jehu. Now we have Beit David, the house of David. So what we now have for the first time is a series of external references to people from sources outside the Bible that mention not only individual kings, but also the house of David. So we are now finally, in the early years of the first millennium BCE, in a position where we can use the biblical account and extra-biblical account as well as archaeology to corroborate some of the events. And this is where I, for one, start feeling more comfortable because we now have at least 3 independent sources that we can work with. Speaking of archaeological evidence, the archaeology that has been unearthed to date reveals that the Omrids far surpassed any other kings in either Israel or Judah as both builders and administrators. In a sense, theirs really is the first golden age of the Israelite kings, at least the golden age that we can identify through archaeology. And yet in the Bible, the description of the Omrid kingdom is quite sketchy. There's mention of elaborate palaces at Samaria and Jezreel, but there's almost no reference to the size or the scale or even the opulence of their kingdom. Indeed, these northern kings are hated by the authors of the Bible. They are referred to in derogatory terms, And it seems that the writers of the Hebrew Bible are consistently trying to uphold the kings of Judah in the south rather than the evil kings of Israel in the north. And yet, the kings to the north, that is the Omrids, seem to be rather amazing. There is no doubt that Samaria, the city of Samaria, is built by Omry, and that this becomes the capital city of the north. And when the site of Samaria was first excavated back in 1908 by Harvard University, it revealed the splendor of Omry's buildings. It was further explored in the 1930s by a joint team, and there we got additional ideas of just how splendid this site was. Even today, the site of Samaria is rather impressive. It's in a rich agricultural region, and from here we've got numerous buildings and other architectural remains. It was apparently conceived from the start as the personal capital city of the Omrid dynasty, and as such reveals grandiose architecture from the time of Omry and Ahab. We also have other instances of the architecture of the Omrids, but some of these are a little bit harder to identify. Indeed, the gates, the chambered gates built at Hatzor and Gezer and Megiddo, to which we referred in a previous lecture as Solomonic, and which for the longest time were identified as part of Solomon's grand building plan, have now been redated by some archaeologists to the time of Omry and Ahab, that is, the time of the kingdom of Israel. This is still open to debate, but everything that we see, the six-chambered gates at each of these cities, as well as some of the palaces at Megiddo, for instance, and perhaps even the so-called stables at Megiddo, might have to be redated from the time of Solomon in the 10th century to the time of Ahab and Omry in the 9th and perhaps even into the 8th centuries BCE. Perhaps the most impressive engineering achievements linked to the Omrids are the enormous underground water tunnels cut through the bedrock beneath the cities of Megiddo and Hatzor. These tunnels provide the city's inhabitants with secure access to drinking water even in times of siege, and this, in the ancient Near East especially, was a critical challenge, because while important cities are surrounded by elaborate fortifications that allowed them to withstand an attack or a siege, they seldom had a source of fresh water within their city walls. By creating these ancient tunnels, the inhabitants could climb down and then out and reach the water underground while safe from an attacking enemy. So it seems, in the light of fairly recent evidence, that we might have to rethink some of our basic hypotheses, and many of the building activities that were previously attributed to King Solomon may in fact have to be reassigned to the Omrids, that is, Ahab and Omry of the northern kingdom of Israel. At Hatzor, for example, some of the architecture may actually date to these later kings. Again, at Megiddo, others as well. So this is currently an ongoing controversy which perhaps only future excavation may solve. Both archaeologically and historically, the redating of the architecture at sites like Hatzor and Megiddo and Gezer from Solomon's time to the period of the Omrids has enormous implications. It removes the only archaeological evidence that there really was a united monarchy and suggests that David and Solomon may have been little more than hill country chieftains. On the other hand, it shows that despite the biblical emphasis on the evil kings of Israel, that they may have in fact been ruling over a golden age. In other words, archaeology at the moment may be showing that our idea of David, Solomon, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah following them may have in fact been topsy-turvy. We don't know what the final solution is going to be. We have to do more investigation, more archaeology, and more research. One thing, however, is clear. The kingdom of Israel and then the kingdom of Judah after it are going to be at the mercy of a new set of empires that are emerging elsewhere in the ancient Near East. The first of these large empires is the Assyrians, the Neo-Assyrians to be specific. We've already met them in the form of Shalmaneser III, But now they come back more fierce and more determined than ever, particularly in the form of Tiglath-Pileser III, whom the Bible calls Pul, P-U-L, and who ruled 744 to 727 BCE. For a little over a century, the Assyrians are going to dominate life in the Middle East, and Israel, as an independent kingdom, is going to cease quite early in the period of Assyrian domination. The capital city of Israel, the capital city at Samaria, is captured in the year 722 BCE, and Israelite territory is subsequently incorporated into the Assyrian provincial system. Indeed, at Megiddo, one of the cities looks like it was simply lifted up from Mesopotamia and placed on top of the mound at Megiddo. The inscriptions of Neo-Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser mention again rulers from our region. For example, one inscription of Tiglath-Pileser says, quote, "I received tribute from Menahem of Samaria. Like a bird, alone he fled and submitted to me." Now, we get such extra-biblical inscriptions, and we are able then to hold them up against the story as told in the Hebrew Bible. For example, 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles are the primary biblical sources we've got for this period of Israelite history. We learn from the narrative in 2 Kings that 4 of Israel's final 6 rulers were assassinated, and that the 5th died from nonviolent causes, while the 6th apparently ended life in Assyrian exile. In other words, it was not good to be a king of Israel during its final years. We are able to look at other inscriptions. One example where we can corroborate the account in the Hebrew Bible with the inscription of Tiglath-Pileser III, for example, can be found in the book of 2 Kings 15, where it says, "In the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Menahem the son of Gadi began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 10 years in Samaria. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart all his days from all the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin. Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menachem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that he might help him to confirm his hold of the royal power." Now, you'll remember that Pul is the biblical name for Tiglath-Pileser III. So Tiglath-Pileser III, in his own inscriptions, says, "I received tribute from," among other people, "Menahem of Samaria." And here now we have the confirmation in the biblical account. And Tiglath-Pileser mentions other people as well. In fact, he says that he took tribute from Jehoahaz of Judah. So, not content with going up against the northern kingdom of Israel, the Neo-Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser III actually campaigned against the southern kingdom of Judah as well. Now, we are further told in the Hebrew account, "In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured," and then it names a number of cities, and ends saying, "and he carried the people captive to Assyria." What are we talking about here? We are looking at the beginnings of the deportations. The Neo-Assyrians loved, when they captured a new country, to deport its people, carry them off somewhere else, and place them elsewhere in their empire, and in their stead place different peoples. The idea being that people are less likely to rebel if they are living far, far, far from their native land, and that one can control them more easily. So beginning already in the days of Tiglath-Pileser III, in about 734 BCE, we get the beginnings of the Neo-Assyrian deportations. These are going to continue, these deportations, through the reign of Shalmaneser V, from 727 to 722 BCE, and even down into the reign of his successor. So we get a series of deportations during the reign of Shalmaneser V and his successor Sargon II, and in the years 722 and 721 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel as we know it essentially ceases to exist. We have the description from Sargon II, dated to 722, 721, 720 BCE, which says, I besieged and conquered Samaria. I led away as booty 27,290 inhabitants of it. I formed from among them a contingent of 50 chariots and made the remaining population assume their social positions. I installed over them an officer of mine, and I imposed upon them the tribute of the former king. This goes well with the account found in 2 Kings, in the book of 2 Kings. And what we get, in essence, is by the year 720 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel has ceased to exist, and it has been incorporated into the Neo-Assyrian Empire. What happened to the people that were living in the northern kingdom of Israel? They are carried off into exile. They are deported. How many people? Well, we've seen, at the very least, more than 27,000 people in one fell swoop. And in the larger scheme of things, we're talking about 10 of the 12 tribes that we've got in Israelite history. These are the famous 10 lost tribes. They are carried off into exile, never to be seen again. Where are the 10 lost tribes today? Who knows? They have been located in North America, in England, in India, and every place in between. Like the Ark of the Covenant and like Noah's Ark, I think that we are going to be hard-pressed to ever find the 10 lost tribes, and yet the quest to locate the 10 lost tribes is still ongoing today, and numerous books are published every decade claiming that they have found the lost tribes or know where to look. For our purposes, though, what we're interested in is the fact that the northern kingdom of Israel ceased to exist only about 200 years after it had been born, and that after it ceased to exist, it is the southern kingdom of Judah that will rise to prominence. It is this rise to prominence of Judah that we will look at in the next lecture.
This ends Lecture